He didn't walk into court expecting to go viral. But what JD Vance did next will be remembered for years. Post in the comments where are you watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the latest stories. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. stood tall and imposing, its marble columns gleaming under the pale morning sun. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Journalists whispered among themselves, their cameras poised and ready to capture every moment of what promised to be a historic hearing. The case at hand, a sprawling investigation into government corruption, had already gripped the nation. But today, the spotlight was on Vice President JD Vance, who had been summoned as a witness. Vance entered the courtroom with a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the chaos swirling around him. Dressed in a simple navy suit, he carried himself with the calm assurance of someone who had weathered storms far greater than this. His presence alone seemed to command attention, and the room fell silent as he took his seat at the witness stand. The judge, a stern-faced man named Judge Boasberg, watched him with a gaze that was both piercing and dismissive. The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Boasberg, known for his sharp tongue and uncompromising demeanor, had made no secret of his disdain for Vance. To him, the vice president represented everything wrong with the current administration, a symbol of power unchecked and accountability evaded. As the proceedings began, Boasberg wasted no time in asserting his authority. "Mr. Vance," the judge began, his voice cold and clipped, "you are here today not as a vice president, but as a citizen of this country. I expect you to answer my questions with the respect and honesty this court demands." The words were pointed, almost accusatory, and they hung in the air like a challenge. Vance nodded calmly, his expression unreadable. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady and measured. But the judge's tone had already set the stage for what would be a contentious exchange. As the questioning began, it became clear that Boasberg was not merely seeking answers. He was seeking to undermine Vance's credibility. He interrupted frequently, cutting off the vice president mid-sentence and dismissing his explanations with thinly veiled contempt. The journalists in the gallery scribbled furiously, their pens capturing every sharp remark and tense exchange. Vance, however, remained composed. He answered each question with clarity and precision, refusing to be rattled by the judge's provocations. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Boasberg's frustration, and the judge's voice grew louder and more forceful with each passing moment. At one point, Boasberg leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he delivered a particularly pointed question. "Mr. Vance, are you suggesting that you were unaware of the actions of your colleagues? That you, as vice president, bear no responsibility for the corruption that has plagued this administration?" The room held its breath, the tension reaching a breaking point. Vance met the judge's gaze, his own eyes steady and unwavering. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "I am here to provide the truth as I know it. I will not speculate or make assumptions about matters beyond my knowledge." Boasberg's expression darkened, and he slammed his gavel down with a force that echoed through the courtroom. "Enough," he barked. "I will not tolerate evasive answers in my court. You are here to serve justice, not to protect yourself." The journalists exchanged glances, their cameras capturing every moment of the escalating drama. The tension in the room was electric, and it was clear that the hearing was spiraling into something far more personal than anyone had anticipated. Vance's calm response only seemed to further enrage the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I believe justice is served not through intimidation, but through truth. I am here to cooperate fully, but I will not allow this court to compromise the integrity of my testimony." Boasberg's face turned red with anger, and he rose from his seat, his voice booming. "Mr. Vance, I find your conduct to be disrespectful and unbecoming of a witness in this court. I hereby hold you in contempt." The room erupted into chaos. Journalists shouted questions, their cameras flashing as they captured the moment. The gallery buzzed with shock and disbelief, and even the court officers seemed momentarily stunned by the judge's decision. Vance, however, remained silent, He rose from his seat, his expression calm and resolute, and allowed the officers to escort him out of the courtroom. The cameras followed his every move, capturing the image of a vice president walking away from the witness stand and into custody without a word of protest. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, the nation held its breath. The arrest of a sitting vice president was unprecedented, and the implications were staggering. But Vance's silence spoke volumes, and it was clear that this was only the beginning of a story that would shake the country to its core. The tension in the courtroom, already at a fevered pitch from Judge Boasberg's earlier outburst, escalated into an almost unbearable pressure as the proceedings continued. Moments before the dramatic arrest, Vice President JD Vance had attempted to speak, his calm, measured voice rising above the discord as he began to plead his case. He rose slowly, a quiet determination in his eyes as he cleared his throat, seeking permission from the judge to clarify his stance. "Your Honor," Vance began, his tone respectful yet firm, "if I may." Before he could complete the sentence, Judge Boasberg's bellow cut through the attempt at discourse. "Silence!" the judge thundered, his voice echoing off the high, cold walls of the federal courtroom. The abrupt command reverberated among the gallery, where a murmur of disapproval stirred. In that instant, the assembled jurors, reporters, and onlookers could see that this was no ordinary session of court proceedings. Vance's brief moment of vulnerability, his desperate bid to reassert his dignity and truthfulness, was brutally quashed by Boasberg's authoritarian enforcement of order. The gallery, composed of citizens from all walks of life, retired veterans, community leaders, and everyday individuals who had once placed their trust in the government, responded with hushed murmurs of support. Some even shook their heads in silent protest at the judge's heavy-handed dismissal of Vance's attempt to articulate his truth. A few elders in the crowd, their weathered faces etched by years of hardship and perseverance, exchanged knowing glances, as if to say that the struggle for justice was an ongoing battle beyond the confines of this sterile chamber. Judge Boasberg, his face flushed with anger, leaned forward and slammed his gavel with a resonance that silenced any remaining dissent. "You leave me no choice," he spat, his words laced with contempt. "Your refusal to answer my questions directly, your continuous evasions, leave you no option but to be held in contempt of court." At that moment, the judge's voice, once restrained by the formalities of the law, now became an instrument of coercion against one of the highest-ranking officials in the nation. Vance, still seated moments before in dignified silence, now stood motionless as the room seemed to draw an icy breath. With not a hint of anger or defiance in his eyes, he accepted the unfolding proceedings with the quiet resolve of a man who believed that his integrity would be judged by history, not by the fleeting passions of a single moment. His posture was unyielding yet sorrowful, a silent proclamation that he would not resort to theatrics even under such profound injustice. Immediately following the judge's decree, the sound of shuffling feet and the low murmur of courtroom officials signaled that Vance's fate was being sealed. Court bailiffs, with an air of routine authority, edged forward to escort him from the witness stand. As Vance's hands were gently yet firmly guided towards the exit, the cameras in the gallery and the myriad smartphones in the audience captured every moment of the unfolding drama. The flashbulbs of journalists erupted like a storm of light, and within seconds, the arrest of JD Vance became the headline of every major news outlet. Throughout the entire spectacle, Vance maintained his silent composure. Even as Boasberg's harsh words rang in his ears, he did not utter one more protest. Instead, his demeanor exuded a melancholy dignity, a powerful counterpoint to the clamor and chaos around him. It was as if he had decided that no amount of anger or desperate defense could alter the course of events that were now set in motion. The courtroom, normally a stage for vigorous debate and sharply contested words, fell into an eerie quiet as the gravity of the moment sank in. Behind closed doors, among the rows of seats filled with everyday citizens, a ripple of support began to form. A group of elderly onlookers, their eyes reflective of years witnessing social change, whispered amongst themselves in low, reverent tones. "That is true bravery," one murmured, shaking his head as if in disbelief that such a monumental figure could accept this fate with such calmness. Another added softly, "He is taking the high road, even when faced with injustice." These whispers crescendoed quietly into an undercurrent of solidarity, with many in the gallery discreetly nodding or murmuring words of support, their unspoken language filled with the understanding that sometimes silence speaks louder than any outcry. Outside the courtroom's imposing entrance, the charged air was not limited to those present. Word of Vance's arrest spread rapidly through the corridors of power and the streets of the city. News anchors on television, radio broadcasters in their studios, and netizens on social media platforms began to dissect the unfolding events in real time. Opinions diverged sharply. Some condemned the judicial overreach as an abuse of power, while others argued that no one, not even a vice president, was above the law. Yet, regardless of the divided public opinion, one phrase would soon begin to circulate, capturing the essence of what Vance's silence meant in this defining moment. "If silence is my punishment, then let it echo across this nation." In the charged silence that accompanied the judge's final order and the somber procession of officers escorting Vance out, the national mood shifted imperceptibly. What could have been an explosive scandal was transformed by Vance's quiet, resolute acceptance of his fate. The silent protest of one man, standing alone in the face of systemic injustice, was about to ignite a wildfire of moral introspection among a populace long weary from political double standards and the erosion of civic trust. The cell was small and stark, its walls painted a dull gray that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. JD Vance sat on the narrow cot, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The air was heavy with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor. For the first time in years, he was alone. Not surrounded by advisors, not flanked by security, not under the watchful gaze of cameras. Just him, the silence, and the weight of the moment. The events of the courtroom replayed in his mind, each detail etched with painful clarity. Judge Boasberg's booming voice, the gavel striking like a hammer, the murmurs of the gallery, the flash of cameras as he was led away. He had known the risks of appearing as a witness in such a contentious case, but he had not anticipated the sheer force of the judge's disdain. Yet, even as the accusations and interruptions mounted, Vance had refused to compromise his principles. He had chosen silence over spectacle, dignity over defiance. Now, in the solitude of the cell, he felt the enormity of his decision. The arrest of a sitting vice president was unprecedented, a seismic event that had already sent shockwaves through the nation. But Vance knew that his silence in the courtroom was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. He had not resisted, not argued, not shouted. Instead, he had accepted the judge's ruling with a quiet resolve that spoke louder than any protest. As he sat there, the faint sound of a camera clicking caught his attention. He glanced up and saw the small device mounted in the corner of the cell, its lens trained on him. It was a standard security measure, but in that moment it became something more. Vance realized that the camera was not just a tool of surveillance. It was a window to the outside world, a way to reach the millions of people who were watching, waiting, wondering. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and approached the camera. Standing directly in its line of sight, he spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but with a calm intensity that carried the weight of his convictions. "If silence is my punishment," he began, his voice steady, "then let it echo across this nation." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. They were not a plea for sympathy or a call to arms. They were a statement of truth, a reflection of the quiet strength that had defined his actions in the courtroom. Vance knew that his silence had been misinterpreted by some as weakness, but he also knew that it was a powerful form of resistance, a refusal to engage in the theatrics of a broken system. He continued, his tone unwavering. "I stand here not as a vice president, but as a citizen who believes that justice is not served through intimidation, but through integrity. A citizen who refuses to compromise the truth for the sake of convenience. And a citizen who will not be silenced by the weight of injustice." The camera recorded every word, capturing the raw emotion in his voice and the quiet determination in his eyes. Vance spoke not for himself, but for the countless others who had felt the sting of injustice, who had been dismissed, ignored, or silenced. He spoke for the farmers struggling to keep their land, the veterans fighting for their benefits, the workers striving for fair wages. He spoke for the people who had placed their trust in a system that had failed them. "I do not seek pity," he said, his voice softening. "I seek change. Real change. Change that begins not with anger, but with understanding. Not with division, but with unity. And not with vengeance, but with compassion." As he finished, he stepped back from the camera and returned to the cot. The cell was silent once more, but the echo of his words lingered, resonating far beyond the confines of the room. Within hours, the footage was released to the public. It spread like wildfire across social media, television, and news outlets, reaching millions of people in a matter of minutes. The simplicity of Vance's message, combined with the gravity of his situation, struck a chord with the nation. Ordinary citizens, drivers, farmers, veterans, began sharing their own stories of injustice, their voices joining the growing chorus of change. The silence that had once been his punishment had become his greatest weapon, a rallying cry for a nation yearning for reform. And as the country watched, listened, and reflected, it became clear that Vance's quiet resistance was not just a moment. It was a movement. The footage of JD Vance's quiet, resolute words from his cell spread across the nation like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere, on television screens, social media feeds, and even whispered about in coffee shops and diners. The simplicity of his message, combined with the gravity of his situation, struck a chord with millions. It wasn't just a speech. It was a call to reflection, a mirror held up to a nation grappling with its own sense of justice. In the days following the release of the video, the public response was overwhelming. Ordinary citizens began sharing their own stories of injustice, their voices joining the growing chorus sparked by Vance's words. A truck driver from Ohio posted a video recounting how he had been unfairly fined for a minor infraction, nearly losing his livelihood in the process. A farmer in Iowa shared her struggle to keep her land amid mounting legal battles with corporate interests. A veteran in Texas spoke of the bureaucratic hurdles he faced while trying to access the benefits he had earned through years of service. Each story was a testament to the quiet resilience of everyday Americans, and a reminder of the systemic flaws that had long gone unaddressed. The hashtag Echo of Silence began trending on social media, a rallying cry for those who felt unseen and unheard. TikTok videos, tweets, and Facebook posts flooded the internet, each one amplifying the message that Vance had so calmly delivered. The phrase, "If silence is my punishment, then let it echo across this nation," became a mantra, printed on posters, shared in memes, and even painted on murals in cities across the country. Television networks aired segments dissecting the speech, with pundits debating its implications. Some praised Vance's courage and composure, calling him a symbol of dignity in the face of adversity. Others questioned the motives behind his silence, speculating whether it was a calculated political move. But regardless of the differing opinions, one thing was clear. Vance's words had ignited a national conversation about justice, accountability, and the power of quiet resistance. In the midst of the growing movement, Judge Boasberg found himself under intense scrutiny. The footage of his courtroom outburst, juxtaposed with Vance's calm demeanor, painted a stark picture of the imbalance of power. Calls for an ethical investigation into the judge's conduct grew louder, with petitions circulating online and protests forming outside the courthouse. Boasberg, once a figure of authority, now faced the weight of public opinion bearing down on him. Meanwhile, Vance remained in his cell, unaware of the full extent of the impact his words had made. He spent his days reflecting, writing, and preparing for what lay ahead. He knew that his silence had spoken volumes, but he also understood that the movement it had sparked was bigger than him. It was about the people, the truck drivers, farmers, veterans, and countless others who had found their voices in the echo of his own. As the nation grappled with the implications of Vance's arrest and the speech that followed, the seeds of change began to take root. The quiet resistance of one man had become a catalyst for a movement, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not with a shout, but with a whisper. The video of JD Vance's quiet, resolute words from his cell continued to ripple across the nation, sparking a movement that no one could have anticipated. What began as a single moment of defiance against injustice had grown into a groundswell of voices demanding accountability, fairness, and reform. As people from all walks of life shared their own stories of being silenced, dismissed, or wronged by systems that were supposed to protect them. The stories were as diverse as the nation itself. A single mother in Michigan posted a video describing how she had been denied housing assistance due to bureaucratic red tape, leaving her and her children on the brink of homelessness. A small business owner in Georgia shared his struggle to keep his shop afloat after being targeted by predatory lenders. A teacher in California spoke of the challenges she faced trying to advocate for her students in an underfunded school district. Each story added another layer to the growing narrative of a nation grappling with systemic failures. Television networks dedicated entire segments to the phenomenon, airing interviews with ordinary citizens who had been inspired by Vance's words to speak out. Panel discussions debated the implications of his arrest and the broader issues it had brought to light. Some commentators praised Vance as a symbol of dignity and resilience, while others questioned whether his actions were a calculated political move. But regardless of the differing opinions, one thing was clear: Vance's message had struck a chord. Meanwhile, Judge Boasberg found himself at the center of a firestorm. The footage of his courtroom outburst, juxtaposed with Vance's calm demeanor, painted a damning picture of judicial overreach. Petitions calling for an ethical investigation into the judge's conduct garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures, and protests formed outside the courthouse, with demonstrators holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Silence speaks louder." The pressure on Boasberg grew with each passing day. News outlets uncovered past cases where his rulings had been called into question, further fueling the public's demand for accountability. The judge, once a figure of authority, now faced the weight of public opinion bearing down on him. His silence in the face of mounting criticism only added to the perception that he had overstepped his bounds. In the midst of the growing movement, Vance remained in his cell, unaware of the full extent of the impact his words had made. He spent his days reflecting, writing, and preparing for what lay ahead. He knew that his silence in the courtroom had been a powerful statement, but he also understood that the movement it had sparked was bigger than him. It was about the people, the truck drivers, farmers, veterans, and countless others who had found their voices in the echo of his own. As the nation grappled with the implications of Vance's arrest and the speech that followed, the seeds of change began to take root. The quiet resistance of one man had become a catalyst for a movement, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not with a shout, but with a whisper. After days of intense public outcry and heated debates in newsrooms and on social media, the wheels of justice finally began to turn. In a decision that startled even the most hardened legal minds, an emergency review of Judge Boasberg's conduct and the integrity of the proceedings was launched. Under increasing pressure from lawmakers, advocacy groups, and outraged citizens, the federal court reversed its controversial actions. The announcement came on a cool, still morning when the heavy steel doors of the detention center were flung open, and JD Vance was led out to face the world once more. Vance emerged slowly, guided by a couple of solemn court officers, his eyes reflecting a depth of pain intermingled with an abiding calm. His face, marked by the events of the past few tumultuous days, radiated a quiet resolve that seemed to embody the very essence of dignity. As he stepped out onto the steps of the detention center, an enormous throng of supporters, elderly citizens with weathered faces, veterans standing tall, community leaders, and everyday Americans, had gathered. Their banners and signs bore simple, yet powerful messages: justice, not vengeance, and integrity over intimidation. Rather than shaking his head in indignation or raising his voice in protest at the injustice he had faced, Vance simply paused, taking in the overwhelming energy of empathy and solidarity. In that moment, every harsh word from the courtroom and every unjust gavel strike transformed into fuel for a movement that sought a better, fairer future. Though still a prisoner of circumstance until the formalities were complete, His eyes, soft but unyielding, communicated that he had not been broken, even as the system had attempted to silence him. With the ceremonial finality of a page turned in a long, painful chapter, Vance's release became not an act of capitulation but one of serene triumph over injustice. As he was congratulated and embraced by those who had supported him, the media cameras captured his unadorned sincerity, a man who had chosen compassion over anger, reflection over defiance. In his first moments outside, he moved with deliberate calm, acknowledging each supporter with a quiet nod and a gentle smile that reassured the crowd, silently telling them that the true battle had always been for the soul of the nation, not for personal retribution. Soon after his release, a massive rally was organized outside the detention center. Thousands gathered in the early afternoon, their voices united in solidarity, not for vengeful retribution but for meaningful reform. At the forefront of the assembly, several community leaders and civic activists had arranged for a temporary stage where Vance was invited to speak. As he ascended the platform, the crowd fell into a contemplative hush. There was no clamor for angry protest. There was only an expectant silence ripe with hope. Standing before the sea of faces, Vance took a deep breath. In his measured tone, he spoke not as a man wronged, but as a citizen dedicated to healing. My silence in the courtroom was not an admission of guilt, nor was it a surrender. He began, his voice resonant yet gentle. It was a choice to let truth speak louder than the clamor of those who seek to divide. I stand here today not to seek vengeance, but to call for a reform, a transformation of our judicial practices so that no voice is stifled by power and fear, and no citizen is left unheard. His words, sparse but brimming with moral clarity, washed over the crowd like a balm. He spoke of the essential values of fairness, the desperate need for reform within the judiciary, and the importance of compassion over coercion. We must remember, Vance continued, that the fabric of this nation is woven with the threads of our shared humanity. Injustice anywhere diminishes the dignity of us all. Instead of retaliation, we need understanding. Instead of retribution, we require renewal. There was a palpable shift in the air as thousands, many of them seasoned by decades of struggle and disillusionment, nodded in agreement. The rally was no longer merely a response to an arrest. It had become a collective meditation on the necessity of change. Lives filled with stories of unnoticed grief, economic struggles, and systemic neglect were being acknowledged for the first time. From the aged voices recounting lost pensions to the veterans lamenting bureaucratic indifference, every story resonated with Vance's quiet call for justice, equality, and reform. In that charged atmosphere, Vance concluded his address with a simple yet profound exhortation. Let us all be the quiet agents of change. Let our silence become a clarion call for transparency and fairness. And together, let us rebuild a society where justice is not a privilege for a few, but a promise for every citizen. As cheers and gentle applause filled the air, Vance stepped down from the stage. His first steps outside the cell were not those of a man embittered by his experiences, but of a visionary soul determined to lead his country toward a remade system, one built on accountability, understanding, and the shared hope of a better tomorrow. Months after his release, JD Vance stood on the steps of the Capitol, the same calm resolve etched into his features that had defined his actions in the courtroom and his time in the cell. The crowd before him was vast, stretching across the National Mall, a sea of faces united by a shared hope for justice and reform. Veterans in uniform, farmers in work boots, teachers clutching signs. They had all come to hear the man whose quiet defiance had sparked a movement. Vance adjusted the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He had returned to the Senate not as a politician seeking power, but as a citizen determined to lead with integrity. His arrest, his silence, and his speech from the cell had transformed him into a symbol of resilience and dignity, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, change was possible. Today, he began, his voice steady, we stand together not as individuals, but as a nation united by the belief that justice must serve all, not just the privileged few. We have seen the cracks in our system, and we have felt the weight of its failures. But we are here because we believe in something greater. We believe in the power of compassion, the strength of unity, and the promise of reform. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the mall. Vance paused, letting the moment sink in before continuing. My silence in the courtroom was not an act of defiance. It was a call to reflection. It was a reminder that sometimes the loudest voice is the one that chooses not to shout. And in that silence, I found the strength to speak for those who have been silenced for far too long. He spoke of the stories that had emerged in the wake of his arrest. The truck drivers, farmers, veterans, and countless others who had shared their struggles and their hopes. He spoke of the movement that had grown from their voices, a movement that demanded accountability, fairness, and transparency. And he spoke of the reforms that were now taking shape, driven by the collective will of a nation determined to do better. We are not here to tear down, Vance said, his tone resolute. We are here to build up, to build a system that values integrity over intimidation, compassion over coercion, and justice over judgment. This is not a fight for one man, it is a fight for all of us. And it is a fight we will win, not with anger, but with understanding. Not with division, but with unity. As he concluded, the crowd erupted into cheers once more, their voices rising in a chorus of hope and determination. Vance stepped back from the microphone, his heart full as he took in the sight of the people who had come together to demand change. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that the movement they had built was unstoppable. In the weeks and months that followed, the reforms Vance had championed began to take shape. Judicial accountability measures were introduced, ensuring that no judge could wield unchecked power. Transparency initiatives were implemented, giving citizens greater access to the workings of their government. And the stories of ordinary Americans continued to inspire change, reminding the nation that justice was not a privilege, but a promise. As Vance walked away from the Capitol steps that day, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had entered the courtroom as a suspect, but he had emerged as a symbol of hope, a hero for a nation yearning for change. And as the crowd dispersed, their voices still echoing in the air, one thing was clear. The movement he had sparked was just the beginning. He entered the courtroom as a suspect and emerged as the hero of a nation. Subscribe so you won't miss the next story that could touch your heart.